They said Nikola Tesla was chasing an impossible dream or hiding something far bigger. When he began constructing a strange tower on Long Island, critics dismissed it as a failed experiment. But what if it was never meant to be understood so easily? Behind the structure was a vision that challenged the very foundations of profit, power, and control. Some believe it threatened an entire economic system built on scarcity. Others argue it simply couldn't work. So why was it abandoned so abruptly? The truth sits somewhere between ambition and suppression, and it still raises uncomfortable questions today. The blueprint for global power. You'd think he'd lost his mind. Picture a skeletal wooden structure rising 187 feet above the quiet shores of Long Island, crowned by an imposing 55-ton copper dome. This monolith was far more than a simple building. It is necessary to completely dismantle the historical misconception that Nikola Tesla was merely trying to build a faster telegraph or competing directly in the limited arena of point-to-point radio. While his contemporaries like Guglielmo Marconi focused on shooting localized signals through the air, Tesla was actively engineering a complete paradigm shift in human civilization. He envisioned the world wireless system. This was a multi-purpose infrastructure designed to bypass the creeping era of physical wires entirely and render physical conductors completely obsolete on a planetary scale. Think about the staggering ambition required to conceptualize a ubiquitous information ecology, functioning like a massive planetary brain, nearly an entire century before the advent of the modern internet. Tesla explicitly outlined 12 foundational services for this facility, focusing heavily on establishing a flawless universal timekeeping system and guaranteeing the instantaneous synchronization of global stock market data. Every corner of the globe would respond simultaneously to a single central hub. The sheer physics of his approach defied the conventional linear models of his era. Tesla planned to utilize the Earth itself as his primary conductor rather than relying on the weak radiation of electromagnetic waves through the atmosphere. His calculations indicated that the planet acts as a highly conductive reservoir of electrical energy, capable of being manipulated to resonate at very specific frequencies. By injecting immense pulses of high-frequency alternating current directly into the ground, matching the natural electrical oscillation of the planet, he intended to generate terrestrial standing waves. He planned on literally pumping electricity into the terrestrial crust, utilizing the deep Earth and the conductive upper atmosphere as the two opposing poles of a massive global circuit. This method would theoretically allow power and data to travel vast distances with minimal loss, entirely avoiding the extreme energy dissipation dictated by the inverse square law. The technological engine driving this terrestrial excitation was the magnifying transmitter. This machine was a radically advanced evolution of his earlier high-voltage resonant transformers, featuring an extra capacitively loaded helical resonator that granted unprecedented voltage amplification and hyper-precise frequency tuning. The physical anchor for this monumental machine was the Wardenclyffe Tower. The specific choice of a wooden framework over standard industrial steel was a strict technical necessity, carefully calculated to ensure the structural skeleton would not accidentally absorb and dissipate the extreme high-frequency currents he intended to generate. That massive copper dome sitting at the peak functioned as a giant terminal capacitor, engineered to accumulate an enormous electrical charge before forcefully discharging the energy to engage the natural resonance of the planet. Adjacent to the tower sat a massive 94 by 94-foot red brick laboratory designed by the acclaimed architect Stanford White, serving as the nerve center housing the massive Westinghouse power generators. The surface architecture was entirely dependent on a hidden feat of massive subterranean engineering to ensure a robust, fail-proof electrical connection with the planet. Tesla supervised the excavation of a 120-foot deep central shaft plunging straight down beneath the tower base. From the absolute bottom of that shaft, heavy machinery drove 16 solid iron pipes an additional 180 feet down into the bedrock. reaching a staggering total depth of 300 feet to securely interface with the deep groundwater table. Tesla needed to physically grip the Earth to establish a low-impedance path, forcing the raw current deep into the conductive core of the planet to power a modernized world. The clash of capital paradigms. Brilliant engineering does not survive in a vacuum. It requires vast amounts of capital, and capital in the Gilded Age always came with a heavy leash. In 1901, Tesla secured $150,000 from banking titan J.P. Morgan. That is roughly $4 million in modern currency, yet it was barely a fraction of the $1 million historians agree the facility actually required to reach completion. Tesla had pitched a high-powered radio transmitter to compete in the transatlantic telegraph market, but his true objective was vastly more ambitious and financially subversive. The late 19th century was defined by a rapid, brutal shift toward industrial energy centralization. Capital was moving aggressively away from isolated power plants and racing toward rigidly structured, centralized alternating current grids. Morgan was deeply entrenched in this exact transition, holding massive investments in the emerging copper wire monopolies and these centralized utility networks. Tesla's vision of unmetered, decentralized planetary power was not just unprofitable, it was a direct, existential threat to the very foundation of this new, centralized economic order. As Tesla began speaking openly about drawing electrical energy directly from the earth or air with a simple receiver, Morgan realized there was no way to restrict access or charge users for their consumption. The financier allegedly asked the ultimate capitalist question, demanding to know exactly where one could place the meter if anyone could freely draw on the power. He was not merely inquiring about a business model, he was drawing an absolute line in the sand against a philanthropic endeavor that defied the industrial requirement for metered, centralized control. The precarious financial stability of the Wardenclyffe project was instantly shattered by the panic of 1901. A vicious corporate battle for control over the Northern Pacific Railway triggered a sudden stock market crash, leading to a massive contraction in industrial credit. Margin loan rates skyrocketed to 60%. And for Tesla, this meant the cost of the essential materials needed to build his vision doubled within months. The soaring prices for the copper and steel required for his 55-ton dome and massive grounding pipes completely wiped out the initial $150,000 before the tower was even fully framed. Investor confidence evaporated entirely in December 1901 when Guglielmo Marconi successfully transmitted the letter S across the Atlantic Ocean from Cornwall to Newfoundland using a significantly simpler and vastly less expensive apparatus. Tesla fiercely argued that Marconi had relied on 17 of Tesla's own patents to achieve this, but public perception crowned Marconi the victor of the wireless race. For J.P. Morgan, this proved that transatlantic telegraphy could be achieved without Tesla's massive, over-engineered, and financially draining infrastructure. Marconi offered a nimble, commercially viable product, while Wardenclyffe increasingly looked like an expensive folly. The dissolution of this legendary partnership played out in a desperately one-sided correspondence. Between 1903 and 1906, Tesla penned over 50 letters to Morgan, pleading for the remaining funds to complete the dome and install the Westinghouse generators. He offered rigorous scientific justifications and deep emotional appeals, invoking American pride, but Morgan remained completely resolute. The financier not only cut off all communication but actively prevented Tesla from securing loans from other banking houses across Wall Street. This total financial blacklisting effectively marooned the Wardenclyffe project, leaving the towering wooden skeleton as an unfinished shell and the laboratory as a dormant monument to a future deliberately starved of capital. The limits of theoretical physics. Imagine attempting to construct a revolutionary machine while the entire scientific establishment dictates that your fundamental premise is impossible. The intellectual battleground of the early 20th century featured a brutal boxing match between Nikola Tesla and the rigid laws of mainstream physics. The establishment repeatedly bludgeoned him with the inverse square law. This uncompromising mathematical limit dictates that any unguided radiation loses power exponentially as it travels outward from its source. To the leading minds of the era, governed entirely by Maxwell's equations, this meant any attempt at omnidirectional power broadcasting was an impossible, mathematically bankrupt folly. You cannot simply throw immense energy into the atmosphere and expect it to arrive functionally intact thousands of miles away. Tesla fired back with a radically different understanding of electromagnetism. He vehemently insisted that his system did not rely on the standard Hertzian transverse waves that dissipate so rapidly in empty space. Instead, he argued for the utilization of longitudinal waves through a process he termed terrestrial conduction. He believed the Earth itself functioned as a massive, highly conductive resonant cavity. If he could precisely excite the planet at its natural resonant frequency using his equipment on Long Island, he could generate terrestrial standing waves. This mechanism would theoretically allow massive amounts of power to be tapped at specific nodal points across the globe, completely bypassing the crippling energy losses associated with standard radiation. The academic establishment scoffed at his claims, yet it is vital to recognize the sheer predictive power of his Colorado Springs experiments. During those late-night sessions of generating arcs of lightning over 100 feet long, Tesla theorized that the entire Earth and ionosphere system possessed a natural frequency of oscillation. He calculated this planetary pulse to be sitting right around 8 Hz. He was heavily criticized for this conceptual leap. Fast forward half a century to 1952, when physicist Winfried Otto Schumann finally managed to mathematically prove that the cavity between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere does indeed resonate at a fundamental frequency of 7.83 Hz. Tesla had correctly deduced the electrical heartbeat of the planet 50 years before the scientific community possessed the sophisticated tools required to verify his math. His unparalleled brilliance was, unfortunately, his most destructive flaw. Unlike his pragmatic contemporaries, who relied on iterative testing, rigorous peer review, and exhaustive paper documentation, Tesla depended almost entirely on mental blueprints. He possessed the baffling cognitive ability to fully visualize complex machinery in his mind, running complete mental simulations of devices for weeks to detect wear and tear or design flaws before ever drafting a single physical schematic. While this methodology allowed for rapid conceptual innovation, it left a frustratingly barren paper trail for modern scientists to evaluate. His notes often featured non-standard terminology like radiant energy and ether gas, isolating his findings from the nascent field of electronic engineering. Because of this extreme secrecy, the highly specific tuning secrets of his magnifying transmitter were never actually written down. When Tesla eventually passed away, the functional key to operating the Long Island facility died with him. This tragic lack of documentation was severely compounded by his absolute refusal to separate distinct technologies. He stubbornly conflated the massive, world-altering task of global power distribution with the relatively simple goal of radio communication. To Tesla, sending information was merely a trivial byproduct of throwing immense electrical pressure across the globe. He designed his towering infrastructure for massive power throughput, a system entirely unnecessary and completely counterproductive for the low-power, highly sensitive requirements of simple wireless messaging. By stubbornly refusing to separate these goals, he left the telecommunications market wide open. A much more pragmatic inventor named Guglielmo Marconi stepped directly into that void, using simpler, specialized technology to completely conquer the emerging world of global communications. The erasure of an empire. The systematic erasure of this monumental undertaking was not just a financial tragedy, but the physical, violent dismantling of a divergent technological timeline. By 1906, the bustling Shoreham site was completely abandoned. The massive generators sat totally silent. Imagine watching your life's greatest work, the key to a revolutionized civilization, sitting incomplete while local Long Island newspapers mockingly brand it Tesla's million-dollar folly. This agonizing reality was the catalyst for his severe nervous breakdown. He was utterly humiliated by the public failure of a project he knew fundamentally worked. The fatal blow did not come from a scientific competitor, but from a staggering hotel bill. For nearly 2 decades, Tesla had lived in a series of luxury New York establishments, most notably the Waldorf Astoria. He was allowed to stay largely on credit, thanks to his close personal friendship with the immensely wealthy John Jacob Astor. Think about the fragile threads of history in this exact moment. When Astor perished in the icy waters of the North Atlantic during the 1912 sinking of the Titanic, Tesla lost his financial protector. Astor's heirs immediately audited the estate and demanded full payment of the massive unpaid bills Tesla had quietly accumulated. Utterly broken and cornered by the legal system, Tesla was forced to sign over the entire deed to the Wardenclyffe property to the hotel in 1915 as collateral. He completely lost control of his own laboratory. The hotel had zero interest in a planetary energy grid. In 1917, the property was sold to the Smiley Steel Company with one singular goal: tear it to the ground. The demolition of the Wardenclyffe Tower was a grueling, drawn-out process. The wooden skeletal framework was built so incredibly robustly that it stubbornly resisted destruction. It required multiple, heavily packed explosive charges to finally bring the towering structure down. On July 4, 1917, the 55-ton copper dome and the high-grade steel framework were finally felled and hauled away as scrap metal to pay off his creditors. The timing of this destruction during the height of World War I birthed a ridiculous, sensationalist rumor. Paranoid press reports claimed the United States government explicitly ordered the tower destroyed because German spies were supposedly using it to send secret wireless signals to U-boats prowling the Atlantic. We must completely eradicate this myth. The federal government had absolutely zero involvement in the demolition. The espionage story was fueled entirely by wartime paranoia and deep-seated suspicion regarding Tesla's status as a foreign-born citizen. The eradication of Wardenclyffe was purely a private, profit-driven salvage operation. Once the surface architecture was sold for scrap, the focus shifted to the subterranean secrets. The massive 120-foot deep central shaft and the sprawling network of subterranean tunnels were unceremoniously filled with earth and construction debris. They simply plugged the hole to prevent a local hazard, effectively burying the physical evidence of this radical alternative energy paradigm for nearly an entire century. The great planetary transmitter was dead, reduced to dirt and legend. The mythology of lost power. Leave behind an unfinished technological marvel of this sheer magnitude, and the resulting vacuum of hard facts will inevitably be filled with wild, sprawling mythology. We have to aggressively tear down the most persistent of these legends, starting with the devastating event in the Siberian taiga on June 30, 1908. A massive explosion flattened 800 square miles of forest, an event widely attributed to a stony meteor airburst. Yet, a wildly popular narrative insists Tesla caused this destruction by test-firing the Long Island facility to send an electrical pulse to Admiral Peary at the North Pole. Think about the physical impossibility of that claim. By 1908, the Shoreham site was completely abandoned, stripped of its funding, and possessed absolutely no operational power sources to generate a localized spark, let alone a transcontinental shockwave. The timeline utterly collapses under basic forensic scrutiny. This conflation of distinct events extends to the persistent belief that the massive wooden structure was a literal weapon. During the 1930s, Tesla openly discussed a theoretical particle beam weapon he named Teleforce, which an eager press immediately sensationalized as a death ray. The public consciousness recklessly merged this later theoretical concept with the actual physical architecture of the New York Tower, transforming a communications and power hub into a menacing energy weapon. He certainly claimed to have perfected a method for projecting concentrated energy beams, but he never built a functional model of such a device on Long Island or anywhere else. This widespread confusion actively contributed to the systematic erasure of the true 19th century memory regarding his actual goal of decentralized, unmetered global power, replacing his complex engineering reality with science fiction. However, not every shadow surrounding his legacy is easily dismissed as fiction, especially when we apply cold case investigative methodologies to the immediate aftermath of his death. In 1943, the United States government actively intervened. The Office of Alien Property, working alongside federal agents, seized all of his scientific files and physical possessions. The official justification was strict wartime precaution, driven by deep military anxiety that his advanced weapon concepts might be acquired by the Axis powers. A technical review by MIT physicist John G. Trump concluded the papers lacked workable engineering principles. Yet the decades-long classification of these documents ignited entirely justified theories of government suppression. We must examine the stark mathematical discrepancy at the heart of this mystery. Initial federal inventories recorded approximately 80 trunks of material seized from his hotel room. When his estate was finally released and delivered to his nephew Sava Kosanovich at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade in 1952, only 60 trunks arrived. A rigorous accounting of this transfer reveals a staggering 20 trunks simply vanished from the official record without a detailed manifest. The absence of those 20 trunks acts as a catalyst for relentless modern speculation, driving researchers to wonder if the government deliberately withheld the complete schematics for his global wireless infrastructure. In the absence of the complete paper trail, esoteric groups have entirely mythologized the towering structure through the lens of a subtle, fluid-like medium Tesla referred to as the ether. While modern physics largely discarded this concept in favor of relativistic fields, fringe theorists boldly claim the facility was actually a machine designed to extract infinite radiant electricity directly from the vacuum of space. They have taken a facility engineered for the highly efficient transmission of conventionally generated power and transformed it into an occult symbol of suppressed zero-point energy, cementing his legacy as a brilliant architect, exiled by the very industrial energy centralization he sought to completely dismantle. The blueprint for modern connectivity. You cannot kill an idea whose time has finally come. Wardenclyffe did not die. It simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. The true conclusion to this saga is a triumphant resurrection that began with a digital miracle in 2012. When the original 16-acre Shoreham property was placed on the open market and faced the imminent threat of being bulldozed for commercial real estate development, a massive global community intervened. A campaign spearheaded by cartoonist Matthew Inman galvanized 33,000 individual donors from 108 different countries to raise over $1.3 million in a mere 6 weeks. This staggering grassroots movement successfully purchased the land, formally establishing the Tesla Science Center and saving his physical legacy from total erasure. The meticulous restoration of this historic site quickly yielded massive archaeological vindication. For an entire century, the deep subterranean passages beneath the tower were casually dismissed as exaggerated local legend. That skepticism collapsed in 2017 when researchers deployed advanced ground-penetrating radar across the Shoreham property. The scans provided absolute, undeniable proof that the massive network of underground tunnels still exists perfectly intact beneath the Long Island soil, preserving the last unexamined physical evidence of his engineering genius. This modern vindication goes far beyond simple historical preservation. It extends directly into the realm of cutting-edge, 21st century technology. In 2018, an initiative known as Project Visiv constructed a towering 200-foot structure in Milford, Texas, made entirely of pultruded fiberglass. They built this monumental composite facility to actively test the long-distance transmission of electrical power using Xenex surface waves. These specific electromagnetic waves utilize the surface of the Earth as a waveguide, perfectly mirroring the exact terrestrial conduction theories Tesla pioneered over a century ago. They utilized advanced computer modeling and modern composite materials to explore the very same physics that bankrupted him. His engineering ghost is also sitting right in your pocket. Think about that for a second. The micro-scale physics of modern wireless device chargers, specifically the resonant inductive coupling used to power your smartphone or delicate medical implants, is the direct, refined descendant of the principles demonstrated by his massive magnifying transmitter. Modern engineers simply took his concept of tuning a transmitter and receiver to the exact same resonant frequency to transfer energy through magnetic fields and successfully scaled it down from planetary dimensions to a span of mere centimeters.